What happens if a hacker breaks into Android? Can it then control the car and drive away for it remotely? And we are making our own infotainment system as basically make products for anyone from like more higher volume car makers to very low volume car makers. So they test their software and their design on like very elaborate hardware that is comparable to the real car. So they work in cycles of months.
Welcome to episode 11 of the Screens podcast. Today we have a guest that has actually reached out to us to be part of the podcast. We were very excited for this one. As always, I am joined by
Shrivaas, hello.
And on the other side, we have Casper Kessels from Snapp Automotive.
First, thanks for having me on the podcast. I'm really excited to start this conversation. So I'm a designer by trade, a UX designer. My background is in UX design for inside the car industry, outside of the car industry, in the more tech industry, working at startups. And more recently, I've joined Snapp Automotive to lead the design and product side of the company. It's a company dedicated to Android Automotive. And we are making our own infotainment system as a product for car makers that don't necessarily have the resources or the experience to build their own. So we have a fully customizable product for that. And at the same time, we help major OEMs with their Android Automotive infotainment systems. So I hope to share a little bit of insights about what is going on with Android and with just UX design in general in the car industry.
Wonderful. I think this is a topic right up my alley because I also have a background in user experience for automotive. So I think we share that in common. And Tom and I spend a fair amount of time in cars, testing them for different projects and so on. And of course, one of our favorite operating systems is Android Automotive, if that's the right word to use. But we can of course get started with the most basic question then. What is Android Auto and what is Android Automotive? We know it, but a lot of people tend to get confused with it.
Yeah, Google is not great at naming products in this case.
Yeah,
there's a difference between Android Auto and Android Automotive. Android Auto is the equivalent of Apple CarPlay. So it's basically an infotainment system running on your phone, and it's mirrored to the display of the car. So there is very little connection between the things you see on the screen and the car itself. It's all running on your phone. Android Automotive is a native operating system for the car. So it's fully integrated with the car and it's not running on your phone. And up until recently, most car makers were using some version of a Linux-based system to build their in-car infotainment system. And Google then announced a special version of Android that is dedicated to in-car use. And most car makers have announced the switch to Android. So it's going to be a big thing.
Yeah, we've been seeing that increasing trend. You know, we saw in different markets, and I think here in Europe we have the Renault Megane,
Volvo as well, I guess.
Volvo as well, and in the US it was Cadillac, if I'm not wrong, GM in general.
GM, Hummer EV for sure, that's in our database.
I think the whole group is now switching to Google. Casper, then what exactly is the advantage of using Android Automotive, versus using Android Auto? I mean, as a consumer, I would expect that I can just sit in a car, plug in my phone, and have everything on my phone as is because I take it everywhere. So how do you think the use of Android Automotive is more advantageous?
Well, there's two things basically. There's an advantage to the car maker and there's an advantage to the consumer. The advantage to the car maker is that Android is a pretty well-known system. It's quite easy to develop it. And so out of the box, it's a lot easier to get going with it as a platform and build a very fast, decent infotainment system compared to a native Linux system. But more importantly, Android has a huge ecosystem, not only of developers, but also of third-party apps and third-party app developers. And so by using Android, you basically get somewhat access to this huge network of third-party apps. So before, or like most cars today, you cannot have Spotify or YouTube or any of the popular apps inside the car because every car maker has its own bespoke infotainment system. So that Volkswagen has to go to Spotify and say, can you make an app for me? And then BMW has to go to Spotify and say, can you make an app for me? And so obviously it doesn't make sense for Spotify to go and make like 50 different apps.
Yeah.
But because it's Android, they theoretically can make one app that runs on all car brands.
That makes
And so
sense,
for the
yeah.
consumer, there's the advantage that basically you can have access to all of the third-party apps and your basically the favorite apps that you use, which I think is the main advantage of like Apple CarPlay and Android Auto. You just look something up on Google Maps, plug on your phone, and you go. And that's something most cars today cannot offer.
Yeah. But this kind of goes against the usual trend of OEMs, right? Where they try to create their own, name it their own, even though the features, even ADAS features are pretty much shared between all the cars. They always come up with their own name to name that feature. How is that going with the OEMs?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing because there is a bit of a divide when you use Android Automotive where you can if you start using Android Automotive, it does not come with the apps and services that you want to use. So you have to find your own app store, your own navigation app, your own voice assistant, etc. Now, Google will happily license this to you. So they say you can get Google Automotive Services or Google Built-in, as it's often called. Then you make a licensing deal with Google and you get the Google Play Store, Google Maps, Waze, the Google Assistant, etc. This is what you see in Polestar, Volvo, Renault, GM. But a lot of car makers are also going the other way, where they say, okay, we do not want to have the licensing deal with Google for a lot of reasons. And that means they have to find their own app store and their own navigation app, etc. And so there are now companies starting up to move into this field of building automotive app stores. But like you can expect, every car maker will want to have their own app store and their own voice assistant, etc. And so you still see this fragmentation. So just moving to Android Automotive doesn't automatically solve that all apps are available in all the cars, because it may still end up that each car maker has their own app, and each car maker will have to go to Spotify and say, or their own app store, and they will go to Spotify and say, will you put your app in our app store? And then they will still go like, why would we build an app for 50 different app stores if we can just put it in the Play Store? So that's also still happening at the same time.
It's funny because it really resembles the early stages of smartphones at this point, where you would almost have the same app, but it would kind of always be different, or you would have the footnote where it's like it only works with this version of Android, but it doesn't translate to the next one. It's very interesting.
It reminds me of the early times of Android when it was still called Android Market and not Google Play Store. If you're as vintage as me, you would know this. But definitely, I think we are going to dive a bit more deeper into this aspect of car makers having their own OS and Play Store. App Store. But before we go down that route, let's discuss a couple more general questions. Do you think Apple will also create their own car OS like Android Automotive?
Well, that's a great question. So you can only guess at this point.
Yeah.
So Apple has made quite an interesting move by announcing a new version of Apple CarPlay that does not just take over a part of the screen, but takes over all of the displays inside the car. So basically, they provide what I imagine is a framework where car makers can basically connect their climate controls and their display and the information in the instrument cluster and mirror that to Apple CarPlay. And then Apple CarPlay can take over the entire digital experience in the car, which is a really interesting move. I think consumers really love this because Apple CarPlay is probably the most popular in-car software at the moment. But of course, Apple depends on the car maker to integrate this, and car makers so far have not shown a lot of excitement because they give, I guess, a lot of power away to Apple. But yeah, to answer your question, I'm not sure if Apple will launch their own native software inside the car, because that also means for them giving up some control, and Apple tends to want to control the user experience fully.
That's true.
And I think they go into that angle where your phone is so powerful right now that you can basically run the entire infotainment system on the phone and provide a uniform experience for everyone.
Yeah, but that's interesting then. How is the integration going to work with car features? With Android Automotive, you can at this point almost control the whole car.
Yeah, not the climate control,
Not
I
the
guess.
climate control, but
at
some
least in our
functions.
experience, yeah, the climate control is different, but car functions
Yeah.
can still be integrated,
Yeah.
right?
So, do you think they will bridge the gap between car controls and Apple?
Yeah, I think this is the interesting point, right? Because with Android Automotive, you can control everything inside the car that isn't safety critical. And so you can make a very deep integration with the car. Now, Apple CarPlay, even like the newer one, will run fully on the phone. And so Apple will depend on the integration with the car to make sure that the car maker can send data to Apple CarPlay. And it's not really known yet how that would work. So I'm quite curious to find that out. But I expect that basically Apple CarPlay will offer a set of controls, like standardized climate controls and standardized like speed in the instrument cluster and other like crucial information. And the car maker will have to do the translation between their lower level software that deals with that and Apple CarPlay.
You mentioned that Android Automotive can control those things that are not safety critical. By this, I would assume you mean things like ADAS, cruise control, these kind of things, right?
Yeah, so there's a difference between controlling things and displaying things. So Android Automotive cannot control safety critical things. So to just give a simple example, you cannot steer the car via Android Automotive, or you cannot accelerate and brake, of course. But it can display safety critical information. So it can display speed and it can display ADAS and other things.
Right, okay.
As long as the legislation accepts a possible delay or something, but that's usually fine. So there are car makers we are working with where we're integrating the full instrument cluster in Android Automotive, and that's totally possible.
Oh, that's very interesting to hear, because that was one of my follow-up questions, because I wanted to know if Android Automotive has access to car data like speed, mileage, odometer, whatever it is, these kind of information. And can this data also be used to develop apps? Because I would see, for example, you see so many apps today like Pace Drive, where you can enter manually how many kilometers you've driven and how many liters of diesel, and it tells you how much you've consumed.
Yeah.
Maybe this could be used to develop apps. This car data could be used to develop apps that could show information like this more natively, right? Do you think that's a possibility?
Yeah, at the moment this is quite limited. So of course Android Automotive provides a layer where a car maker can push data and Android Automotive translate that to Android Automotive for use inside the car. For system apps, so apps developed by the car maker itself, you have access to a lot of this information and you could do stuff with it, such as routing and like you mentioned, stuff around speed and etc.
Yeah.
But for third-party developers, there's a more limited set of APIs available that they can use at the moment. The Google apps use a templating system, much like Android Auto, where Google will say, if you want to push an app to the Google Play Store, we are responsible for the safety of the driver, basically. So if there's an app in the Play Store that is super distracting, it's Google's responsibility to allow that or not. So Google will say, okay, you can put your app in the Play Store, but we will enforce templates on the app. So we will say, okay, you can only push apps for navigation or for parking or for media, and you have to use specific templates that Google has designed for your app. And so with these templates also comes access to certain information of the car, which is currently quite restricted, but there is the possibility to open it up later on.
But I mean, when we were testing the smart routing functions in multiple vehicles, I think Megane with the Google Maps was top. Yeah, one of the best. And not only was it, we haven't tested the actual range of the Megane, so that's kind of on the Renault side of things, but really the integration and the ecosystem and the architecture was so clear to navigate. I mean, it was like your phone, which you're used to, plus the vehicle functions. So it made it such a flawless experience. It felt just natural, you know. Whereas in the others were on the other side of the spectrum.
On the other side of the spectrum, yeah.
Yeah, I think the Polestar system or Volvo at this point as well and Renault are the only ones where I hear owners say, like, actually, I don't use CarPlay. I find the Android Automotive system much better. So to give an example of how deep the integration goes, I think in the Polestar, if you plan a route with chargers on the way, the car will know which route you're taking. And so when you approach your charge stop, it will start heating up the batteries already. So it charges much faster. So this kind of integration is totally possible with Android Automotive.
Yeah, that's totally next step though, because that takes into consideration the life of the battery and how well it's going to maintain. That's really good.
I mean, to be frank, when we tested the Android Automotive systems, we did not imagine that the integration was this deep. You know, we thought it was more still at a layer, layer at the OS level for the touch screen or something like this. But I think we come to a very critical topic now, because with Google comes the inevitable privacy concerns.
Your favorite topic.
We made a video with the Megani Tech and where we discussed this, because I was thinking that as a consumer, if I don't want to use Android Automotive or Google on my vehicle, but I really want the Renault, you know, then I'm kind of forced into this, right? And then there are, of course, privacy concerns surrounding Google, which may or may not exist with other OEMs that develop their own software. For example, some may have all the data encrypted within the car itself. But in the case of Google, it's of course Google integrated. So what are some privacy concerns that you've seen surrounding Android Automotive that have come from users, OEMs, different?
Yeah, I think first of all, if you're using a car which has Google built in, so it has the Google services, basically you need to use a Google account to make full use of it.
Exactly.
So I think there are a lot of rental car companies have Polestars in their fleet, and so these are run without a Google account, and so you can use it without a Google account. But of course, the power of the Android system comes by having the possibility to download apps in the Play Store on your Google account, by sharing the data, so you can use Google Maps on your phone and have your favorites saved there, and then you have them in the car as well. So of course you can use it without a Google account, car makers say, but it's very limited then. So that's definitely a restriction.
Yes.
That's something perhaps the car makers that will not use Google services, but just Android Automotive with other services can benefit from, do differently. But on the other hand, which car maker does not have their own account these days? So
True.
There's lots of data for each car maker that is being used, and it basically depends on the privacy policy of each car maker how this data is handled. Where some are very progressive with it and store a lot of personal data only inside the car. Other car makers, if you read their privacy policy, or if you even find it, they are a lot less discreet about it.
But in your experience, have you seen, I mean, okay, let's take one step back when it comes to privacy. In your experience, have you seen that OEMs are better than Google, in this case Android Automotive, with privacy, or is it the other way around? What's the trend that you have observed?
I think it's hard to focus just on Android Automotive for this. So Android Automotive is just an Android system. So it comes with the same privacy settings you have on an Android tablet or an Android phone. So you can basically choose for each app if you want to share the location, what permissions you want to give, etc., etc. But the car in itself collects a lot of data, and it's up to the car maker how to deal with that. So that's not enforced upon by Android Automotive.
Okay. That's interesting. Yeah. Tom, you had something?
No.
Okay. I mean, I just wanted to then dive a little bit into the topic of how deep the integration of Android Automotive is. You just gave an example earlier where you said that when you set a route with charging stops on the way, the car starts to heat the battery automatically to make it conditioned to the charger. Do you have any other such examples that can speak a little bit about how deep Android Automotive is integrated into the car? Because this is not immediately evident when you play with the system,
Yeah. So Android Automotive provides a whole wide range of APIs. So the layer that sits between Android Automotive and the lower level software of the car is called the VHAL in Android terms. And that translates data from the car to Android Automotive. And so it also depends a little bit on the car maker and what kind of lower level software they use, what you can send to Android Automotive. So we have worked with startups that build their own lower level software, and they have a whole data set available of very accessible car data, and we can send that to Android Automotive. So even though it's not technically legal, we made a concept showing like, hey, from Android, you can control stuff like the throttle or the steering input. You can do that. You shouldn't, but you can do it. So you can basically access a lot, much more than you could basically do today already.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, that is very deep.
Yeah, I mean, in my mind, I'm picturing a sci-fi movie where someone's hacked an Android. No, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that they can, but when you say you can control
We're avoiding to get sued. So
yeah, I'm not saying that we can.
Be careful.
But since you said it's possible to control the throttle, I'm imagining a sci-fi movie where they're actually showing this. But anyway, jokes apart.
Yeah, and I mean, that comes with serious security concerns, right? So I think there's lots of news right now of car makers being hacked. So it's very difficult, a security issue. There seems to be car brands that do it better than others. And so Android poses a serious question there because it's such a broad open system. Car makers don't tend to use the latest version of it. So what happens if a hacker breaks into Android? Can it then control the car and drive away for it remotely? And so the answer to that is basically the lower level software. So it's always up to the car maker to make the safety critical software resistant to outside attacks. And that's very difficult to do. We've seen cars being hacked via key fobs, via everything.
Yeah.
But basically, a car maker should consider Android not to be unbreakable. You should imagine that someone can hack into your Android car, and then that's why Android does not deal with safety critical things. There's a barrier there
that makes
that
sense,
a car maker should prevent from being breached.
I guess this is the case with everything, really. I mean, even unbreachable systems always are breachable. You just have to find that one person that will finally find a way of doing this. And I guess with cars becoming more fly-by-wire, this will be something that we have to consider. Basically, like leaving your doors in the house, locked, and then considering if they're anti-theft or are they just like cheap doors, and you can kick them in. So
I mean, it's the same thing as security measures continue to evolve. Security threats will also continue to evolve. This is how it's been historically.
Even with things that are probably more relatable to bigger audience. Even when they introduced the PayPass or pay by touch payment systems, where you had like below 50 euros, you don't even have to sign the card. You just click and move on. I remember cases of where they're not actually pickpockets, but like, I guess, credit card pickpocket people. They will go with terminals in the tram or the bus and just click and do multiple runs for just like few euros, but they would do hundreds a day, and that would total up. I don't know how they would use the data and how they would, I guess, essentially skim the cards or something. But I mean, we're moving to the digital age, and this is something to consider.
Security is always a concern. Let's speak about security for one more question. Casper, you mentioned earlier also that there is a possibility to access a huge open source library when it comes to Android. And I remember the good old days of using Android phones where we used to unlock the bootloader and play with it and stuff like that. And basically one advantage Android offers with its open source system is the ability to sideload apps, use third-party apps and so on. And this also brings with it some amount of security threats because you don't know what the third-party developers have done. Is this a similar situation in Android Automotive and cars, or is Google a lot more stricter with this at a more integration level, for example?
So this is up to the car maker. So a car maker can load third or system apps side loaded onto the car.
Okay.
So, for example, if you are a third-party app developer, you have to stick to the templatings of the Google Play Store.
Okay.
But if a car maker using Google built-in wants to build like a special app, they can avoid the whole templating issue and say, okay, we take responsibility of the design of the app and the updating of the app. And so we can sideload this app onto our system. So there have been examples of that before. What you want to prevent, of course, is that non-car maker developers
Exactly.
put their own apps inside the car. And so that's up to the car maker to build a solid foundation in there so that you cannot access it while your technicians should still be able to
That
access the
is
system.
very interesting. Do you think this is not only because of the demand for the entertainment apps in the Western markets, opposed to Chinese cars where you have so many entertainment karaoke selfie apps that you can download to your car and basically turn the car into a third living space? Yeah.
Again, the problem here is that the car market is already relatively small compared to the number of smartphones and other devices, and then you have a single car maker. So I'm sure car makers would want to go to Netflix and say, hey, can we have an app, a system app in our car so that people can watch Netflix? But Netflix doesn't care about a few million cars. They care about hundreds of millions of devices. So it is possible, but I think it's restricted by the kind of apps you want to have in the car and their motivation to build a dedicated app.
Okay, let's jump over a little bit to another topic. We work with a lot of OEMs. Some of them have very openly said us, yeah, we are jumping to the Google Suite. Some of them are very intent still on developing their own OS, their own voice assistants and so on. Why are car makers increasingly switching to Android Automotive? I mean, you did mention a few advantages earlier, but is there something really concrete that sets apart Android Automotive versus developing your own OS and voice assistant systems that even huge OEMs like Renault, which is almost a national OEM of France, switching over to Android Automotive?
There's a difference between switching to Android Automotive and also sticking to your own in-house developed services. So almost everyone is switching to Android Automotive for the ease of development, the faster system, etc., and the possibility to have third-party apps. But then you can choose to have Google built in and get all of your services from Google, or you can find other third-party services or build your own. And so there is a big difference there, and it's, I guess, mostly a business decision rather than a technical decision. So the business decision is that will you give away all of your services to Google, one licensing deal, so very simple, but you get everything in return and the most popular services, which comes with a cost, and it comes with a kind of dependency on Google. And Google is not always the most popular service, especially in countries like China. So, for example, Polestar is going to build a different infotainment system in China than it has in Europe and the Western market. So that's one reason why car makers wouldn't choose for Google built-in. Another reason is the sort of hardware requirements Google imposes. If they say, okay, you can have Google services, but you must have certain hardware requirements so that it runs well. That's another reason. But yeah, the dependency on Google is the big one, and we see lots of major car makers choose not to go with Google and create their own app store or license their own app store and their own services.
Yeah, this is very interesting because it connects to something that Joachim Mathis from Valeo has said on our podcast, that to run some of the systems, the hardware is so expensive that even the purchasing price for the OEMs is almost like retail for us for something normal. It's in hundreds of euros, and then you multiply that by the millions of units they have to make for the car, and it just drives the price so high up that it just doesn't make sense to run this at the moment, at least. Yeah, it's super interesting. Going with hardware, I mean, how powerful are these vehicles now from the hardware point of view?
Well, compared to your smartphone and tablets, it's not that impressive, of course. So because of the long development cycle, so cars that start development today will be launched in 3 or 4 years. So the hardware will be out of date 3 or 4 years. So it kind of depends on the kind of system that you want to run, how powerful the hardware should be. But I mean, we develop our own infotainment system on Samsung tablets that are 3 or 4 years old.
Okay.
And they are comparable to a new car today.
Oh, wow.
That's some challenges, no, when you have to look for old devices to create your new tech.
And that adds up to our experience in some of the cars.
Oh, yeah, could be.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
We have seen in some vehicles that we test, it's being on the topic that the system tends to freeze when you're throwing too many things at it, when you're like trying to. I remember this is one car where we set the navigation to somewhere outside of Germany and it just froze. We had to do a factory reset to get the system working again, So
I think hardware-wise, it's going to get a lot better soon.
Hopefully.
Just because of the advances of hardware development and the access to, I mean, you don't need a huge amount of power to run an infotainment system. So it's going to get better, but still you have to develop good software. So a lot of the clunky UI you see is not because of the hardware, it's because of bad software development.
But what are some difficulties that these car makers may face when creating that UI, Because I look at, for example, Google Automotive. It's a little unfair to compare Google Maps with Volkswagen Maps or something like that, because Google Maps has been historically the number one for a decade now. But let's say you're comparing the Polestar with the Volkswagen, then what are some difficulties that Volkswagen, if they decide to use their own system, may face when developing this UI,
I think in terms of maps, it's not necessarily the UI, it's more the data behind the map.
Definitely.
So, they license a navigation from Here Maps or TomTom or whoever. So I don't think they make their own. And so, it depends on the services you use, how good they are and how used. Like I can imagine that it's not impossible to make a navigation app that is better than Google Maps. But there's also kind of people are used to using Google Maps, and so it's hard to convince people to use another app. That's one thing.
True.
But in terms of like infotainment design and development, what we see a lot of challenges, because up until recently, car makers were making everything in some kind of Linux-based system or some other system, and suddenly they have to convert the entire team to Android, and so there is no history or background there, and so they're struggling to find out like what are the best practices in Android development, which UI framework to use, etc. And so you see some mistakes being made there, or some unusable decisions that lead to a weird UI or a slower
so
product.
they're essentially learning as they go.
I think that would be the trend. That would be the trend we'll see going forward as well. You are developing your own Android Automotive based OS at Snapp, right? Tell me a little bit, and you're a UX designer, and tell us and the audience a little bit more on what is the role that UX design and research has to play in ensuring a good OS for the consumers who will end up using it. Because I think this is a very crucial topic that a lot of OEMs miss out on and a lot of people are not aware of.
The state of software development and design in the car industry is a little bit trailing behind the tech industry. So we were working at a few OEMs on their Android system, and we saw the kind of challenges they have. So that's when we decided, okay, let's see if we can build something ourselves, because we also see lots of car makers that start up or have low volume that do not have the resources to build them their own. So like, let's see what we can do if we build our own, starting from like best practices in design and development. What kind of infotainment system can we come up with? Maybe it's just the same as car makers today and they're actually doing very well, or maybe it's something completely different. And so at the core of it is a fast development cycle. So we noticed in car makers that they test their software and their design on like very elaborate hardware that is comparable to the real car. So they work in cycles of months. Just, I wrote some code. I now want to see how it works in the car. That takes a long time. So we started already by saying, okay, what if we run everything on small tablets? It's all Android. You can run it on an Android tablet and you can start testing with it. And so the next thing we did is pair designers to developers. So we see in car companies today, there is a design department and there is a software department, and they don't really talk. So the designers design something for months, it's done, and they throw it over the fence to the developers, and then they can go and start working with it. Whereas we work together with designers and developers. And so from a designer's perspective, it's important to understand the framework you're working with, the technical side of it. And from a developer, it's important to learn from the designer that this is something you're making that is going to be used by people. And so this perspective is important to be brought into the entire organization. And so that's how we started. We in short cycles, so we iterate multiple times per day, just start figuring out how can we make the simplest infotainment system. So what are the features you use the most that are crucial? And let's start with that and then gradually build it out.
Yeah, are you somehow defending yourself from data bias? We had recently a case here where we read a study, and the survey really was done by a survey agency that usually targets a certain group of people. They're usually older age and they're usually male. And, the study was interesting and the article was very interesting. But if you dig through what they have done in the past, it really comes out that this is so highly biased towards a certain group of people that if we would apply this knowledge to something now, probably by the time we develop the product, they would most likely be already passed onto a different life. So how do you guys defend yourself from this?
So we have our core product with the core functionality that is basically just media navigation and climate control. So these are 9 out of 10 interactions you have with the car. And they have to work for everyone from age 17 to 100 with who are very technically averse or who have never used a smartphone before. That's the default. It has to work for all of these people. And so because we have these tablets, it's very easy to take this tablet, mount it in the car, and start testing and trying with people. And so when this core system is working well, then that's when you start looking at which kind of car maker we're working with. So if we're working with a multi-million high-end hypercar, the customer base will be different from if you're working with a cheap car sharing, like small city car, where you have a super diverse group of customers. And then we work with these to adapt the interface to those use cases.
Good.
Nice.
Glad to hear.
Yeah, and let's stay on this topic a little bit more of cars and smartphones and digital devices. On our podcast, Dr. Peter Riesker said that cars of today are comparable to smartphones on wheels, but cars of the future will be much more powerful than smartphones. Smartphones will be cars without wheels. Do you see cars becoming much more powerful and versatile digital devices compared to smartphones in the future by any chance?
What is a smartphone on wheels?
You like how we were discussing earlier, right? You plug in your smartphone and that's the infotainment system essentially, and then you're driving. So it's like a car is like a smartphone on wheels, like it's just a digital device in the infotainment system.
Right, like an all-purpose device that has everything in it. Right. Yeah. So it's an interesting thought. I think we hear that a lot from car makers. I'm not so sure about it. So the one thing we learn when we test our devices and maybe observe people using the car is that the car is a device that gets you from A to B. It's a very specific kind of tool that transports people, and the infotainment system is a part of that device. and the infotainment system is there to help you go from A to B in a safe and comfortable way. And so within that context, there are very useful services you can create to help drivers go from A to B in terms of navigation, parking, etc. In terms of a general purpose device, there's a lot of talk about cars becoming like a second living room or whatever, and people will spend hours inside the car watching content. So I guess first you need to research properly, how will the car change and how do people respond to it? Will people actually spend time in the car? So during COVID, of course, I saw lots of colleagues with cars have their meetings inside the car, because if you're at home with the kids, that's the only quiet space you have. And so there is maybe an opportunity for the car to become more than just a transportation device. But then you can again ask the question, if the car is more than a transportation device, what is it that people will do inside the car? Is it work or entertainment? And if it is, what are the problems that people have inside the car that an infotainment system can solve? So I think there's a lot of like, we're going to turn the car into a cinema or whatever, but most people will take their phone and watch it there. So maybe the solution is not to turn the car into a smartphone, but to make sure you can stream your video to the car from your phone. Because I already have a smartphone. Why would I need a second smartphone with wheels?
Makes sense.
So there's a lot of assumptions there. And I think car makers are very eager to push this because they want to make the car a device where people spend time so they can earn a little bit of like subscription money.
True.
But there is not really, there's like a lot of research that needs to be done before to make it useful. And that's very challenging. And that's this like making stuff that people want is something that doesn't happen very much currently.
Yeah, I think you compressed all our previous guests into your speech right now, because it's so diverse between the opinions, but they kind of all revolve around the same thing. So it feels like the concepts, really, because they're just ideas at the moment, are being pulled in every direction, and they're trying to incorporate, the subscription model inside the car. But then they are like, how much time will people spend? And a certain group of people says, yes, it will be a third space concept like we see in Asia. And now, it's slowly being brought to Western markets. But then other people say, yeah, but this will be a sad future if you have to spend 6 hours in the car, for whatever reason, except driving from A to B or A, B, C, your destination. So it's like this fight. I know you always said lesser evil, but actually it's very interesting which way it's going to be pulled, because no matter who we talk to from different parts of the automotive industry, like we had Mr. Stefan Hertel from Saint-Gobain Securit, where they do glazing, and he was very open about the fact that they are actually working about making the space in vehicles, the external and internal glazing, as an advertising space for you. So, it's like this fight. But personally, I feel like this would be so sad if you, instead of going, play football, go for a date, I don't know, cinema to enjoy the sound, the visuals, all these pleasurable things that we do, you sit in your car and for 6 hours, and then another group of people says, yeah, the biggest enemy of car entertainment is your personal device. That is, it's suited to you. Although the iPhones look exactly the same although maybe mine is green, yours is white, but when you open it, it's a new phone. It's totally different phone. Then how do you compete with that? So yeah. I'm glad you guys developing your own system are aware of this, and you are very on the fence with going into the sad future of being glued to the screen, even in your car.
Yeah, reminds me of the i7.
Yeah, but the i7 has a very limited entry point. It's not for everybody.
That's true.
That's true. You can have the big limo and the screen in the back, but even when the limousines were cheaper and less crazy, how many limos do you see on the street? So it's for different type of audience, for sure. Moving on, how does a process of creating an AOS look like?
So from a design perspective, it's pretty unlimited. So you have lots of freedom as a designer to pretty much do what you want. Of course, there's restrictions in terms of the UI library that the developers will use. So if you want to do fancy gradients and with see-through blurred effects, that's going to cause some issues. But if you work within these bounds that are really like pretty unlimited, then you can do whatever.
That's interesting because I think GM was very proud to announce that they were working with Unreal Engine 5.
Unreal Engine 5, yeah.
Yeah, or NVIDIA. I'm not sure, but one of the big computer games softwares and development houses, and now hardware, I guess, as well. And then your system being suited for multiple vehicles. How limited are you with the graphics, basically, how it looks like?
So if you want to render 3D content, then you need to have a 3D rendering engine, and so that could be Unreal or could be others. It kind of depends also on the car maker we work with. If you work with a high-end sports car company, then of course they really like to show 3D graphics inside the interface, and then it makes sense to use a 3D rendering engine to show stuff. Others really don't care, want just a simple system. So it's pretty open again to what you can do. So we set up our infotainment system so that it is completely customizable. So in terms of UI, we build our own theming engine, so it's super elaborate. You can basically make your infotainment system look completely different between car brands. But beyond just UI, it's also flexible in terms of which architecture you'd like to use and which components you want to display inside the car. So yeah, if we work with a sports car company that wants to have a cool charging animation of their 3D sports car with cool animation, that's all possible. And if we work with people not using very expensive hardware, then we tend to steer away from that.
That makes sense. It's also quite interesting that you decided to make this Snapp OS, this OS that is based on Android Automotive. I hope I'm using the right terminology. I want to know a little bit more about how you identified the market gap, where your product fits in, and what those market gaps are, if you can share it with us, because it's quite interesting now to see this new surge of automotive OS.
Yeah, basically up until recently, with every car maker making their own bespoke system, for any other company, it doesn't make sense to make their own infotainment system and sell it as a product. But now with Android, anyone with Android development experience can go and build an infotainment system. And so since we were working in the car industry for quite some time, we saw that there are many car makers starting up. And there are lower volume car makers that do not build their stuff in-house. So they need to license it from a big supplier, and then you basically get a pretty basic system that may not work very well, or it's not the most advanced or whatever. So we thought, okay, well, we are experts in Android, we can build our own system. So what if we see what we can do with Android Automotive and build the best system? So we are a software company. We approach it from a software company perspective. And we say, okay, we have opinions about how you should interact with the car. Let's see if we can build this and verify our assumption that there are car makers out there that want to have like a world-class user experience without having to pay lots for it. And so that's kind of the assumption where we started 2 years ago. And now 2 years later, we have an infotainment system and we're working towards the first cars to be on the road.
Very nice. I mean, given that there are not too many OEMs, I think then that makes the market a little limited. So I'm really excited to see, or maybe one day have in the garage a car with your operating system for us to test as well. And
we're also quite surprised by how many little startups there are doing really niche cars. And we basically make products for anyone from like more higher volume car makers to very low volume car makers. So even car makers that convert a classic car to an EV that want to have some kind of infotainment system, but that doesn't dominate the whole beautiful look of the car, but you want to have Google Maps inside the car. From these like low production volume car makers to higher ones, it's very fun to work with such a diverse kind of group of companies, going from, like I said, classic cars to specific safari vehicles to anything really.
So, for example, if Brabus comes to you, would you be able to facilitate their needs inside the MBUX experience?
So we provide a full infotainment system. So that would replace the whole MBUX system, which is not advisable. Of course, we work with OEMs on their systems and we make apps as well for Android Automotive. But we work with companies that do not have an infotainment solution at the moment. And so then we can provide both the software and the hardware as well, depending on who we work with.
And let's take for 1 second the Renault Megane Tech and the Polestar. These have the Android Automotive system directly from Google with all the Google services, everything built in, looks like a Google Pixel phone, you know. And then you have your operating system, which is also based on Android Automotive. Could you tell us also a little bit more on how they differ and how your OS is a bit maybe advantageous compared to using Google's stock OS?
Right. Yeah. So we are basically saying, okay, we provide the infotainment system, and then we help the car maker decide which services to use inside the car that best fit them. Now, I think Google Automotive services are really great, but Google tends to talk only to really high volume car makers. And so that our customers will never, like Google will not even answer them. So they do not have the option for Google Automotive services. Then for the very low volume car makers we talk to, we sometimes even suggest to just stick with Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, because it doesn't make sense to pay for an app store and a navigation app, etc. If you can just use Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, which is much cheaper to license. And then so we build the stock infotainment system with a charge app and with everything you need to control the car, and then media navigation is handed off to Apple CarPlay and Android Auto. And then for the more higher volume car makers, we then work with our partner network to suggest which app store to go for, which navigation app best suits them, and everything basically works in our system, and we will help to adapt it to make it work.
If you can share with us which OEMs have your system.
Unfortunately, I cannot yet.
Okay.
We are working towards the first car, so we hope to announce soon who we're working with.
Fair enough.
But we cannot share it at the moment.
Now I'll get an email. Remove that question after.
No, we're totally open about it.
Yeah, fair enough. How do you prioritize user experience research in your company? Do you conduct user experience research, and do you prioritize it as well?
So we do it in different phases.
Okay.
So initially, to get the core of the infotainment system right, we did it internally in the company. So because we have tablets, we have built our own little firmware updater and our own, we call it an app store, but it's not an app store. It's for development purposes, right?
Okay.
And so I can stick this thing in my car and I can test it either with someone driving and I play around with it, or if we are in a safe area on a parking lot, I play it with myself. And so that's how we develop the core of it. Because we are in the end users of the product as well. And so we have a diverse group of employees inside and in the larger group of companies. And so we've figured out the core interaction there. But then when we work with a car maker, we have access to their customer base and we do user research for specific areas. So if we work with a sports car company that wants a track-day-focused app, we have to understand what the average customer does on the track. Or if we work with a off-road vehicle, I don't do any off-roading, so I cannot design that. So I need to understand what the average off-road customer does on a typical day. So then we do specific user research.
Considering the what metrics do you define a success of this iOS? And we are in an era where I guess if you're successful, the volumes will be huge for you with the implementation of the system. We're not in the 90s anymore where in Linux, Windows and Mac OS, or the 80s, actually 70s, where they were fighting to be the leader and then no one actually knew what's going to happen. We've all kind of lived the history now, and we are aware that if you're successful, it is big time successful. So what metrics do you consider to be a successful iOS?
So I mean, you're completely right. Everything in the car industry is about volume. So that's why a lot of the car makers we talk to are quite desperate because nobody wants to talk to them. Okay. So instead of having one or two huge customers, we focus on having a lot of smaller customers, and that way we can achieve lots of volume actually. And so success for our product basically means, first of all, having production cars driving with our system on it, which we'll soon achieve. And then also being able to, we want to show to the car industry how to develop infotainment systems and how much better they can be. And so the next thing would be that we're seeing right now is car makers are coming to us not only because they have a need for an infotainment system, but they want the best infotainment system in the market and something different than already exists. And for us, that would be the success metric. Can we get car makers to come to us because the design is very good and we provide the best user experience? And if that leads to the high volume, that's then even better.
But I guess you're going by some sort of gut feeling at this moment. You can't really put a table and say, yes, if we do this, this is a successful. It's still kind of fluid.
Yeah, of course, it's fluid. I mean, there's a difference between having a financially healthy company and building, and then at the same time being able to build a great product. So because we work with car makers at the moment, like large OEMs, we help them with their Android system, etc. We get revenue from there, and we put all of that into the product of the company. We can basically focus fully on building the best product there is. And we're not concerned about reaching high volume very quickly, because we are sustainable and we want to build the best product. So we don't want to compromise and reach some kind of high volume brand with a bad product. We want to build the best product, and with that reach the volume we want to achieve.
It makes sense.
Yeah. And let's ask one final question, which
I have one more, because
you do.
You ask and let me fire after you. Yeah.
Sure. I personally did my research in the field of personalization of automotive HMIs. What role do you think personalization plays in cars of today when it comes to the infotainment system? Do you think it's important that users are able to receive personalized recommendations, or have the ability to personalize their infotainment systems to the way they like it?
So that's 2 points again. Receiving personalized feedback is very important. So we were thinking about how do you make the interaction with the car easier and safer, and that's basically by eliminating as many steps as possible. So especially the interactions that take many steps to complete, like opening a specific playlist or finding a specific location. The car knows a lot about the driver, and it's not being used today. So we are playing a lot with AI to figure out how can we give personalized suggestion to the driver at the right moment that will skip many steps in the interface. So that's one part of the personalization. And we're playing with it. It's super fun to see what kind of things you can come up with. But the other side is just the personalization of the system. So I already mentioned that we made our own theming engine. And so it is theoretically possible to customize the interface completely like you want. And so we speak a lot with car makers. For example, again, the sports car makers, where you buy a 500,000 euro car and you get to choose everything in the interior, including the type of leather and the color and everything. Why not choose the UI theme from the system as well, so it matches your interior?
True.
These are things that we can do now, and we see a lot of interest coming from there because it's important that the UI blends in very well with the interior of the car. So you can customize it already in the purchase process or afterwards even. Like, I don't know, maybe you are a sports car company and you're competing in a race and you have a special livery for the car. Then you can show a UI theme based on that livery around the race inside all of your customer vehicles. You can do all of that. So I see that there's lots of interest from the car maker from this perspective. From users basically as well, especially Android users. There's a special, like with the new material design, you can basically customize everything on your phone to fit your favorite theme colors. And so we see lots of Android users use that as well, and we can extend that to the car as well.
Yeah, I mean, this, I think, is something already quite available with different sport modes, right? If you choose the Eco, it's all green and very not aggressive. And then if you choose sport, it's either dark blue or very strong red, and the graphics are more modern and more aggressive. Yeah.
And in EV, you hear fake sounds.
In EV, you hear vacuum sounds. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. But it's super interesting because I, for one, would love to, irrespective of whether or not I'm racing, put some nice livery-based skins on my infotainment, But go ahead.
And we can do it over the air.
That's
Instead
cool.
of all the drive modes, they are pre-programmed inside the car. We can push new UI themes over the air and have it update on your companion app as well. To give this unified experience.
Yeah, I mean, this brings another question or problem, actually, rather than a question. I mean, for example, I'm a very avid Garmin user and I am into the Garmin ecosystem, and Garmin has their own... by the way, I'm not endorsed by Garmin, just to make it, but I really enjoy their devices. And you can install your own look of your watch, basically. But some of the designs that are not Garmin, that are just available widely on the App Store, are just unusable. So you can be easily lost in the user experience or just usability in total, in general. Yeah. So it's not that easy to make a good-looking, functional new system. And even if you switch between eco mode and sport mode and, just changing the colors is not that easy even then.
Yeah, true. Very true.
Yeah.
Yeah, so far we work with car makers on that. So we impose restrictions, of course. So we also don't want the product out there that is has really awful colors or looks. And we also don't want users to pick a font that is unreadable. So there are basic safety and contrast and accessibility issues that have to be restricted, and then within there, it's a challenge to find the right balance.
Yeah, and as well, it gives you lots of flexibility to change things, but at the same time, you can always lose this kind of identity of the car, if you do too many updates, and it will just do a full remake of the system basically, and you're lost. You get in the car and it doesn't look anything familiar to you or the brand. Lots of challenges with options, I guess. The more options, the more challenges at the same time. And I wanted to touch more of before we finish. I wanted to touch a bit on the personal aspect. You created a blog where you share your thoughts on many aspects. Actually, very similar to what kind of we do in Experts in Cars on our YouTube channel. So it's quite interesting to read through your thoughts. For the general public that listens to us, which car in general, and then maybe which system outside of yours would you say could be a pleasant experience?
I think we mentioned the two already a lot.
Okay.
Polestar and Renault, I think, have the best systems today, especially Polestar. I mean, as a designer, I find it very important that stuff like safety and ergonomics are taken into account. And when you look at the Polestar system, it's really obvious that this was a high priority. So one of the main issues I have with car interfaces is that they make the buttons too small.
Oh, yeah.
Because it looks better. No other interface you use in your daily lives has big buttons. So the trend is to have the same. Like if you have big buttons in a car, it looks weird. and so it's very difficult to make big buttons look good. And so Polestar made it part of their branding. And so their touch surfaces are much bigger because, of course, you're driving a car on a bumpy road on a touchscreen. That's not ideal. You need to have big buttons.
I mean, I think Mercedes didn't hear the thing that small buttons are better because...
I mean, Mercedes has these huge icons, but I think it's like Chinese OSs and Tesla's OS keep me up at night with nightmares, you know, like I would not want to use that on a daily basis. I'm just driving around, I want to adjust my climate control, just give me a knob to turn the temperature, not look in the touchscreen and press like small arrows here and there, you know.
Yeah, and it's easy to get lost.
And the other thing is that the system of Polestar is very simple. It's so easy to make an overly complex system. Like adding stuff to an interface is super easy. Everyone can do it. You can add as many features as you want. It's no big deal. But making something easy and simple is very difficult. You see it, of course, with startup car makers because they don't have the time yet to add more features. But it also just makes the system much better if you don't have like 25 different settings and options and apps and etc.
I believe most of them, when they sit down to the drawing board, their idea is to make it easy and clear and simple. I doubt they sit down and make it, let's put everything in there.
Yeah, we are missing out on this, we are missing out on that. And then just...
Although BMW kind of feels like they threw everything in there.
No, I mean with BMW, my personal gripe was that there are too many apps and it's very hard to find something and the names of the apps are not what you think they would be. So it's a mismatch of expectations personally. But yeah, I agree. I quite like the Volvo Polestar system. It's quite nice. And especially the Android integration. Like you go into the maps and I just type my Google account and everything was there. My favorite destinations, my home address, office address, maybe even Tom's address because Google knows where he lives. But, everything was there. It was
it now.
It was super interesting and I quite loved that system as well. So that's a very interesting direction that the industry is taking, going for Android Automotive. And I'm very curious what Apple or Microsoft or someone else has to counter.
Oh my God, Microsoft, imagine the updates, you're stuck in traffic and then auto update starts, your car shuts off,
Blue screen of death.
This is my opinion, by the way, avoiding the lawsuit again. Lastly, I think you have to promise us that once the cars hit the market, you send us an email and we'll be able to fetch one of those cars here for our benchmarking purposes.
Of course.
We would love to have it over.
Put it up on screens as well. So can't wait for the premiere or the embargo to be lifted for you guys and you'll be able to share the great news. If you have the need, obviously, to share where to find and how to contact Snapp or yourself, please, this is the time, basically.
Yeah, we're called Snapp Automotive, so just Google Snapp Automotive and you'll find us. We're pretty high in the Android Automotive search results.
Nice.
Super.
You mentioned Casper has a blog as well.
Yes, and the blog?
Right, yeah, my blog is called The Turn Signal. So it's my personal blog on automotive UX design. So I try to bridge the gap between academic research, because there's lots of it, and the practical design perspective of it. So it's completely dedicated to
highly recommend
design.
it. It's a quick read. So nice, easy, digestible, very good. Well, it's been a pleasure having you on. Thank you for reaching out to us to be a guest on the podcast. Really different perspective from you and very open. Thank you for that. With most OEMs, the people we have on, they're open, but they're still held by some limitations due to what they're working on. And thank you for the honesty and being very open. For the listeners and viewers, you can find the podcast on YouTube and Spotify in video form, and as well audio will be all the major platforms, so Spotify, Google, Amazon Music, and Apple Podcast, and the Screens podcast, very simple to remember. It's been a pleasure. Casper Kessels from Snapp Automotive.
Thanks for having me on. I enjoyed the conversation.
We did too.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.